What was the greatest movie ever made? Now, the idea may seem meaningless. I mean, how do you define greatest movie? What, is it the acting? Is it the directing? The cinematography? Its emotional impact? Box office success? There's a lot of stuff to consider. But if I had to attempt to answer this question, then no doubt my answer would be Titanic. Released in 1997, this romance disaster film, based on the most famous shipwreck in history, was so epic, so grand, so ambitious, it became a cultural phenomenon, as famous as the shipwreck itself. Using these revolutionary new digital effects, James Cameron forever changed the landscape of filmmaking. And while you can argue if Titanic is the greatest movie, what can't be argued is that this is without question the greatest performance by a director of all time. His mastery of technology, the risks he took, his obsessive attention to detail, we will never see another movie like this ever made again. James Cameron, the filmmaker, the explorer, the pioneer, he didn't just create a movie, he created a whole experience that you had to go watch in theaters. And boy, did people go watch in theaters. The movie smashed all box office records, became the highest grossing movie of all time, 11 Academy Awards in 1 year. As I'm writing this, Avatar 2 just crossed the $2 billion mark. James Cameron now owns 3 of the top 5 grossing movies of all time. And to make that stat even more impressive, those 3 movies are all original creations. They're not based on any kind of prior IP or franchise. James Cameron is the GOAT. So today we're going to talk about Titanic, not only the story, but some of the techniques that they used to execute this massive project. Before I get into the story, I want to talk about Titanic. Why was the Titanic so memorable? The story of Titanic unfolded much like a Greek tragedy. Full of irony, you have the grandest, most luxurious ship in the world, the largest moving object ever made up until that point, sinking on its maiden voyage, and it wasn't just that it sunk. It was the way it sunk. It wasn't a violent head-on crash into the iceberg. It was a glancing blow, but it was enough to sink the ship in a very slow manner. This made the people on board really take in the moral lessons of the disaster. You see this real progression that the people on board go through, from hubris and ignorance to denial. Many people thought the ship wasn't going to sink, to straight up panic and chaos, and to finally despair. Plus, you had the struggle of class, the rich and the poor. Because it was the maiden voyage, many of the ship's builders were on board. The Guarantee Group, the master engineer was on board, Thomas Andrews, the CEO of White Star Line, Bruce Ismay. Add to that all the famous people, John Jacob Astor, Guggenheim. Many of the ship's workers stayed on, even when the rooms were flooding, just to keep the lights on. Titanic just represents the Edwardian age, the Gilded Age. It's the perfect microcosm of society, barreling towards disaster. So let's talk about this plot. The film opens up in the middle of the Atlantic. In this explorer vessel, you have this treasure hunter, Brock Levitt, who's rummaging through Titanic's underwater grave. And let me just pause and say, how badass is James Cameron? He actually went into a submarine and went 2.5 miles underwater to get real footage of the shipwreck. I mean, that is such a badass thing to do as a director. The water pressure is 6,000 pounds per square feet down there. One wrong thing and that submarine is getting crushed. So very ballsy, very high risk move by James Cameron to do that, and I tip my hat out to him. So we're in the middle of the Atlantic, and Brock Lovett, our treasure hunter, is searching for something. A highly valuable necklace called the Heart of the Ocean. And this is what drives a lot of the first act, is that goal of finding the necklace. And James Cameron does an excellent job of setting up some GSU in a lot of these scenes. They're searching for the necklace, and in between that, there's scenes of Brock on the phone with investors who are funding the project. He's telling them he hasn't found it yet, he's running out of time. So even in those opening scenes, James Cameron establishing the goals, the stakes, the urgency there. It's all just simple, solid screenwriting. There's a great moment where they find a safe. They bring it up to the surface, and they're popping champagnes and busting out the cigars because they thought they found what they were looking for, just to open the safe, and it's empty. I want to highlight this moment here because it's a great example of how your scenes should flow. So it goes high and low, the scene. You want your scenes to have that kind of variation where they start off very happy because they thought they found what they're looking for, and then the scene ends and they're all disappointed. Have the emotion and energy of the scene change from beginning to end. He doesn't find the necklace, but he finds a drawing of this lady and she's wearing the necklace. So anytime you give your hero bad news, oh, you didn't find it, you also want to give him a little nugget in there to help him keep going. You give your character the bad news, but there's always a little nugget of hope there. And that's how we're introduced to Rose, our main character here. And they send her out to the ship, so she's looking through all her old belongings that was lost on board the Titanic. And I thought James Cameron did an amazing job of just hinting the flashbacks. So the movie is a flashback. You know, I'm not a big fan of flashbacks. I like for the story to focus on the here and the now. But if you're gonna use flashbacks, this is how you do it. She's going through the monitors of the images of the shipwreck, and James Cameron is cutting back and forth between the ship underwater in ruins to when the ship was brand new in 1912. They're going back and forth. I thought that was a great use of the flashback, and it's a great tease because the story is a flashback. He tells the story through the eyes of a survivor. And when I was a 10-year-old kid, I was actually a huge fan of Titanic. My mom had an old Titanic book in the bookshelf. So me being a curious kid, I was going through all the books in the bookshelf and I found this Titanic book. So I actually came into Titanic very well versed on the story. Now, Titanic is a story that's been done dozens of times by different directors, and there's TV series, there's animated movies, there's all kinds of Titanic media. And every time they start the story off, it's always in the same place. They're in Belfast, the Titanic is docked, all the passengers are boarding, and they're about to set sail. So James Cameron, starting off the movie in the present day, in the underwater shipwreck, that was actually a very risky, bold choice. And there's even a moment in that opening sequence where they show a computer-generated animation of the shipwreck and what exactly happened. This is a great, great moment because it's very risky. You're basically telling your audience the ending of the movie, how the ship sinks. But because everyone kind of knows the story, James Cameron decided, okay, I'm just gonna give you a brief rundown of what happened so you're a little bit more informed and you could appreciate the sinking a little more. It's like when you watch a Netflix show. They give you a roundup of what's happened before, so you know a little bit more going into the episode. That's exactly what James Cameron did. I thought it was an excellent choice. It's a very risky choice. You're basically showing the ending to people. And I remember being a 10-year-old kid and watching this movie, and it just made me so aware of choice in filmmaking. Titanic is one of the movies that made me want to be a filmmaker, especially some of these aspects that you really see the difference in directing and choices made in the story. Watching this as a 10-year-old, it really blew my mind. It really did, because 99% of the stories of Titanic, they always start off the same way. The ship docked, everybody's waving, and they're setting sail for the maiden voyage. James Cameron decides to start off in the modern day, exploring the ship, and he's telling you the story through the eyes of a survivor. I thought that was such a great choice, and not only does it inform the audience more of the details so they can appreciate the story more, but it also deepens the connection with our main character, Rose. So just great choices by James Cameron, excellent use of the flashback, teasing it with some of the physical objects, just awesome. And all of that will lead us into Act 2. And this is when the real story starts. They're all boarding the ship, and what we have is basically a Shakespearean tragedy. Romeo and Juliet on a sinking ship. That's what Titanic is. James Cameron doesn't try to reinvent the wheel when it comes to screenwriting. He'll take a story that's tried and true, that's already proven to work, and just adapt it to his world. He does this with Avatar. Avatar is basically Pocahontas in outer space. So the main conflict is between Rose DeWitt Boudicca and Cal Hockley, which is her fiancé. She's pretty much being forced to marrying this rich guy to ensure her family's survival. And she falls in love with Jack, who's a struggling artist, poor, third-class steerage passenger. He's pretty much a bum. So she's fallen in love with a bum, and everyone hates it because they want her to marry the rich guy. That's pretty much the story. So a lot of this section of the movie is very slow and very boring. There's very low GSU. James Cameron is just basically introducing you to all the characters and to the ship, because the ship is a character in of itself. The only reason it works is because of anticipation. The audience knows what's going to happen. They know the ship is going to sink, and all hell's going to break loose. So there's a built-in patience there. James Cameron knows that he has time, and he also knows one very important thing. If you don't care about the passengers, if you don't care about the ship, then you're not going to care when it sinks. What separates this movie from disaster porn? Is your emotional connection to all the characters. So he needs to establish this. And this is what James Cameron is doing in this part of the movie. Not only does he introduce you to all these passengers on board, but he also shows you all the little nooks and crannies of the ship. Seriously, there's shots of the engine room with these giant pistons moving about. He shows you the bow of the ship. He shows you the stern. There's a scene where Rose and Jack are talking, and they're in the gymnasium, which was state-of-the-art at the time. No ship had a gymnasium in it. He shows you the steerage and the third-class passengers. He shows you the bridge and the officers piloting the ship. He shows you the cargo hold. He shows you every single part of the ship. And there's many other Titanic movies that don't do this. They stick to the same sections, the grand staircase or whatever. But James Cameron shows you every single section of that ship. There's a scene that's part of the chase sequence where Rose is running down to the boiler room, and you see this beautiful woman in this white dress running across this like hell-like landscape where all these men are just covered in black, just shoveling coal into the boilers. And let me just say that the costume designers did an amazing job with Rose's outfits. Even as a little kid, I was just amazed at how beautiful Kate Winslet looked. And I just wanted to give a nod to the costume designers because she looked stunning. And as a little kid, I fell in love with Kate Winslet. And that's how you know you have a good love story. And you see this with teenage girls. They're in love with Leo. Anyways, her dress is amazing. Another aspect that I think is underrated in Titanic is how funny it is. A lot of these slow scenes are injected with some pretty funny jokes. There's jokes about Rose having a Pablo Picasso painting, and he was unknown at the time, and Cal's like, I bought him cheap. There's jokes about Sigmund Freud and psychology, because that was a new thing in the early 19th century. So the Titanic is filled with a lot of good jokes and very funny moments. Even amongst the chaos, there's very funny moments. So I thought that helped carry a lot of those slow scenes. The dinner scene where you have Jack, who's pretty much a homeless bum, and he's having dinner with some of the richest and most famous people on the world. There's a lot of irony there, and it made for a lot of funny moments. Another great moment I want to highlight is the drawing scene. I thought this scene was great. First of all, that's actually James Cameron's drawings. Just to add on to his amazing resume, is he's an amazing drawer. Yeah, the drawing scene I thought was great because that was the first scene that Leo and Kate shot together. And she was naked. So I thought there was a real nervousness there that played out excellent on screen. Eventually they're caught by Lovejoy, which is Cal's like bodyguard. He kind of plays a villain in the story. They catch him in the room and it leads to a big chase sequence. But the one thing I want to highlight here before I move into the sinking sequences is James Cameron is excellent at following the action. So in that chase sequence, they end up in the cargo hold, but that's also the exact moment where the iceberg strikes and that room is flooded in 10 minutes. And Jack and Rose run up to the A deck and they actually see the iceberg. The lookouts that called the iceberg out were actually distracted by Jack and Rose messing around there. A huge wave of ice comes crashing down and almost hits them. They're right there at the center of the action. This might not seem like a big deal, but every other Titanic movie there is out there, I always see the main characters when the iceberg strikes, you know, maybe they're in bed and the strike wakes them up, or they're in the other part of the ship and then they feel a vibration. And James Cameron puts Jack and Rose right at the center of all the action. So from here on out, the movie really picks up the pace, or picks up steam, is when the iceberg strikes and the sinking. The iceberg strikes, though that scene is 37 seconds long. It's the exact length of time that the real ship had when they spotted the iceberg. They had less than a minute to react. So James Cameron, the historian, just adding those little details. And from here on out, the movie's pretty straightforward. You got a disaster film and it's all chaos. They're just trying to survive. But one aspect I want to highlight here is the stolen coat. There's a scene where Jack steals a coat and a hat so he can sneak into first class because his clothes are all raggedy. And when all the characters are gathering together and they're figuring out what's happening, right at that moment, they accuse Jack of stealing the necklace, and then they find the necklace on him. And to add on top of that is this stolen coat that Jack had stolen earlier. Now, we know he didn't steal the necklace, but he did steal the coat. And that stolen coat just adds enough doubt, because now there's real doubt in Rose's mind. Did this guy just steal this necklace? And there's just enough doubt there that I think it makes Rose's decision way harder. Rose has the choice to either go on a lifeboat with her family where she'll be safe, or to go back into the bowels of the ship where it's already flooding to save her boyfriend, who could be a liar. Doesn't quite know exactly. And it makes for some really hard choices, especially when you see Kate go down in there. She touches the water. It's freezing cold. The lights are flickering and they go out. So there's a real fear element. There's a real doubt in her mind. And it just makes the drama so much more complex. Okay, it's instead of just having a sinking ship, you have all these elements to it. It's great. James Cameron does an excellent job of putting his characters in a position where they gotta make a tough choice. And he does this all throughout the sinking scenes. There's another scene later on in the sinking where Cal, who's a man, and it's been very hard for men to board lifeboats, he has a chance to board a lifeboat, but he sees Rose with Jack on the other side of the ship, and he has to make a choice. Does he save his own skin, or does he try to get Rose? And he goes after Rose. And then when Rose chooses to stay with Jack instead of go with him, he gets super angry. He pulls out a gun and starts firing. Then he realized that he put the valuable MacGuffin device, the heart of the ocean, he put it in the coat that he threw onto Rose. So he has to make another tough choice. Do I go after them, or do I try to save my own skin? So just another really difficult decision that a character has to make. And I can't stress how important this is. You have got to put your character in a position where they got to make really hard choices. And this is where their true character is revealed, in these moments. So having Jack in jail, the stolen coat, the necklace, just add so much more layers to the drama. Much more than just if the ship was just sinking. But balance is the key. And just to give you an example, there's a scene that James Cameron omitted from the final cut. It was a scene with Jack and Lovejoy fist fighting. They were flooding the first class dining saloon. They had to flood the room and drain it and flood it again to get more takes. And they spent days on this scene, and James Cameron didn't want to cut it. And it was basically the resolution of that subplot. It was Lovejoy and Jack fist fighting. But he realized when he was watching the movie and when they were doing preview screenings, they realized that while all that subplot was working early on in the sinking, at this particular point of the movie, when the ship is about to go down, none of that stuff mattered. And all that mattered was the ship itself. And he realized watching the movie that it just seemed unrealistic that these characters will be fighting over a necklace, you know, while this ship is going down. It's just, he had to cut it. And this is what I mean. The balance is the key. And while that stuff was working early on, that subplot, at this point in the movie, it just wasn't working and it had to go. So the rest of the sequence is pretty straightforward. You have a lot of great visual effects that I'm gonna get into later on in the video when I talk about some of the post-production and VFX. But just great moments, so many amazing scenes, the funnels collapsing, the dome of the grand staircase being flooded, all the background actors, they did such a great job. James Cameron went to each individual background actor, 150 of them, and gave them all backstories of who they are and what they're doing on the ship. The drunk chef, you got Leo's best friend, Fabrizio. He gets smashed by the funnel falling. Sucks, all right? Fabrizio never got to see the Statue of Liberty. All those firemen in the boiler rooms just keeping the ship's power running to the last second, the band playing music to the end. You got the captain in the control room going down with the ship. You know, people were very honorable back in those days. Because, just to give you an example, when the Costa Concordia sank in 2012, the captain actually boarded one of the first lifeboats and left without telling anybody. So I just want to highlight how honorable people were back in those days. And then we move on to the climax of the movie, the ship breaking apart. How incredible was this moment? The lights go off, the ship breaks, all the different angles. This was one of the greatest sequences I've ever seen in theaters. Just incredible, incredible VFX. James Cameron does such an excellent job of creating an experience in theaters. It felt so real. I could really picture myself there. Like, what would you do if you were a man on the Titanic? I know who I'll be, all right? I'll be that guy in the top hat and the tuxedo. I'm dressed in my best and prepared to go down as scheduled. Hand me a brandy. Or, you know, the captain who commits suicide with the gun. If you ask me, if I want to freeze to death or take a bullet in the head, that sounds like a pretty good option. I would have been like, yo, hand me that revolver. In real life, Captain Murdoch was actually a hero. James Cameron kind of did him dirty there. And he even regretted doing so because the family of Murdoch was very disappointed in the movie, the way he was portrayed. He was the main one organizing the evacuation and making sure all the lifeboats were filled. In real life, Captain Murdoch was a hero. So after that very dramatic sinking sequence, it left such a somber mood that there's only one thing left to do, and that's end the movie. Because there's two stories parallel here, you have the 1912, the ship sinking, but you also have this modern day story of Brock Levitt, who's after the necklace, and they're exploring the shipwreck. So James Cameron tries to end the other storyline, and I'm gonna show you this alternate ending, and we'll talk.
The hardest part about being so poor was being so rich. But every time I thought about selling it, I thought of Cal. And somehow, I made it without his help.
Holy shit. Look, Rose, I don't know what to say to a woman who tries to jump off the Titanic when it's not sinking and then jumps back on when it is. I'm not dealing with logic here, I know that, but please, think about this for a second.
Oh, I've thought about this for years. And I've come all the way here to put it back where it belongs.
Wait. Just let me hold it in my hand. Please. Just once.
My God. You look for treasure in the wrong place, Mr. Lovett. Only life is priceless. And making each day count.
Thank God James Cameron didn't use that ending. It just feels so fake. You have this 90-year-old lady dangling the necklace, and then Brock is like, oh my God, and then he touches it, and then she just drops it in the ocean. Like, come on. That is so unrealistic. In real life, I would have grabbed that chain and just boom, just checked that old lady, tossing her overboard. Just to give you an example of characters saying what's on their mind and saying how they feel, and just, I've said many times, keeping things hidden. And the ending that they used was so much better. Okay, this old lady quietly in the middle of the night drops the heart of the ocean at the wreck site, quietly, nobody knows, keeping things hidden and letting the audience figure stuff out. So that was the story. I want to talk about the production now because James Cameron didn't just create a movie. He recreated the event, literally. He built a full-size replica of the ship in this giant water tank. The whole facility was $40 million. And they basically had a full-size replica of the ship with 270 degrees of ocean view. And James Cameron's obsession with details is legendary. Because the ship was brand new, they had to build a lot of the props from scratch because everything was brand new on the ship. And he did insane research. The carpets, the wood panels, everything had to match the original. He put the White Star Line logo on every single cup and dish. Details that no one will notice. In one moment early on when the ship is docked, the replica was docked on its starboard side, on its right side, but in real life, the ship was docked on its port side. James Cameron wanted it to match with the photos. So that whole opening sequence was actually shot in reverse. Every single sign, the actor's wardrobe, everything was shot in reverse and then flipped in post. I mean, just, it's so much more extra work for a tiny detail that no one will even notice except James Cameron. He notices it, and that's all that matters. So just obsessed with getting every detail as accurate as possible. So you have this giant replica, and the whole thing could actually tilt 6 degrees for the sinking. But in real life, the Titanic was tilted 20-something degrees, way higher. So James Cameron used Dutch angles and composited the water line to give the illusion that the ship was further tilted than it was. And this giant replica was quite impressive. The stern of the ship was on a giant hinge, and it could go a full 90 degrees. And then there's certain sections of the front of the ship that can plunge further into the water. Just an impressive structure in and of itself. And just to shoot all this, they had to use a real-life construction crane, almost like a giant jib. And they had this huge platform that could be raised or lowered. James Cameron was infamous for yelling at people during the production, but hey, you got these giant set pieces in this water tank, all this lighting and electricity. There's a lot of danger there. James Cameron flying down in this giant platform yelling at you. This is just legendary stuff here. The amount of planning for this film is unheard of. I don't think Hollywood would ever make another movie like this again. And this was a very difficult shoot for the actors. It was long hours in these water tanks, and I've worked in a water tank before, all right? They're dirty. So a lot of the actors, they got cold, infections, and flu. Kate Winslet got pneumonia because she refused to wear a wetsuit. And James Cameron wouldn't let the actors leave the tank. If you had to go to the bathroom, you had to just piss in the tank. So these tanks were dirty. You know, this was the lifeboat scene where all the people were floating in despair. So he wanted these actors very uncomfortable. I mentioned before, he got together with every single background actor, all 150 of them, and gave them each names, individual storylines, what they're doing on the ship. James Cameron also brought in an etiquette coach to train the background actors how to stand and walk and properly greet each other as if they were in 1912. Especially if you're a first-class passenger, they had their own etiquette and their own mannerisms, and I thought he did a great job of nailing this aspect. This is something I noticed when I saw the movie again recently. I noticed that what a great job the background actors were doing, especially during the sinking. You had a bunch of actors clinging on to deck railings and slipping and falling. The reason why all that looked so good is because it was real. A lot of the set pieces were made out of foam and rubber. So when they put the ship upside down, those were all real reactions by the stunt players and by the background actors. They were slipping and falling and landing on stuff for real. A lot of the actors also had rollers on the back of their life jacket. So they would slide down the deck. This is what really separates James Cameron's sinking from other movies before. When I watch some of the other Titanic movies, A Night to Remember, the one in '96 and the one in 2012, they don't have that same chaos and unpredictableness that James Cameron's version has, where characters slip and fall and they land on stuff and they flip around and it's just chaos. I love it. So the final thing I want to talk about is the post-production. The VFX in this movie were truly groundbreaking and very difficult, even by today's standards. Titanic was the first big budget tentpole movie that incorporated green screen heavily. It pioneered the use of things like motion capture. There was even shots where the stunt performer would morph into a CG model in the same shot. I mean, this stuff was unheard of at the time. And even today, it's still very difficult to pull off. Titanic just had the perfect mixture of practical effects and CG. And I think that's why it looks so damn good. Because nowadays, movies just go full CG. I mentioned the giant replica model of the Titanic. Well, that wasn't the only model they built. They built all kinds of models From miniatures to mid-size to the giant replica at Baja Studios, they had all kinds of models that they used. There's one particular instance where they wanted to shoot one of the models breaking in half, but they wanted to get more than one take. So they had to build the model out of like this special lead material that would allow them to break it and put it back together easily and do it over and over for multiple takes. I mean, this is just some of the problem solving that they had to deal with in this movie. They also had a model of the shipwreck itself. So they painstakingly made a detailed replica of the shipwreck, and they shot exteriors of this model and they combined that with footage of the real shipwreck. And this was a moment that blew me away when I watched the movie, because I had seen footage of the Titanic shipwreck before, and it's through almost 3 miles underwater. There's barely light there, so it was very dark, and you barely could see what's in front of you. Anytime you see footage of the Titanic underwater, at that time it was usually very dark. But I noticed in the movie they had like these sweeping shot of the bow, just pushing us into the promenade deck. I was like, how did they get this footage 2.5 miles underwater? Well, it wasn't real. They used some real footage, but they combined it with footage of the miniature model. And this combination of practicals and CGI, this is why the movie looks so good. I was hearing an interview with Stephen Quayle, who I believe was one of the ADs on this film, and he said that the reason why Titanic looks so good is because on one moment, you might be looking at a CG model, and just when you think you figured it out, the next shot is an actual real shot of a practical. And it just keeps the audience guessing, like, oh, is this CG or is this not? And in the scene where they're showing Titanic's engine room, Titanic used 2 huge triple expansion steam engines, literally the size of a 2-story building. And James Cameron was searching everywhere around the whole world for a ship that was still operational that used that kind of engine. And there was only one ship left that used a triple expansion steam engine, and it was the SS Jeremiah. It was an old Liberty ship. And the only problem was that while the engine was accurate, it was way smaller than the one that Titanic had. Titanic's engine was the size of a 2-story building. So what James Cameron did is he shot the engine room, but included like these miniature set pieces in the background and the foreground. And then later he green screened firemen and engine room workers and then included them in the shot. And that's the way he sold the illusion of the giant engine room. It constantly keeps you guessing, like, what? Is this real? Very impressive stuff. I mean, just something as simple as the visible breath. He wanted to let the audience know that it was cold outside. So they shot real breath elements behind black and then composited into the final shot. But they had to do this to hundreds of different shots. It's so much extra work that so many other directors wouldn't have done. This is why the Titanic looks so realistic, even today, because nowadays movies just go full digital, so you can just tell it's digital effects. But when I watch Titanic, that combination of digital effects and practical effects, it makes the movie look so much more realistic. The last thing I want to talk about before I close this video off is the music. My Heart Will Go On. It's one thing to have a box office hit, but for that movie to also produce a #1 single, that is truly incredible stuff. I just want to mention that James Cameron didn't even want to use the song. He wanted no words on any of the music. But because the movie went so over budget, he thought this would appease some of the studio executives to have this hit song included. But the way he included it was very clever, because throughout the whole movie, you don't hear that song. throughout the whole movie, there's just this melody, and then boom, right at the end is when you finally hear the words of like, every night in my dreams. And when it comes in, at that point, if you're not crying, then you're dead inside. In retrospect, it's easy to look back on Titanic and think that it was always gonna be this smash hit movie, but at the time it was the most expensive movie ever made, filled with risky, bold choices, and with how risk-averse Hollywood has become, we may never see a movie like that ever made again. Some of the studio heads wanted James Cameron to cut the movie down to 1.5 hours so it could have more viewings and they could recoup some of the money they thought they were gonna lose on it. And thankfully, James Cameron stood firm, and he famously said, if you cut this movie, you're gonna have to take it from me. And if you wanna take this movie from me, you're gonna have to kill me, because filmmaking is war. So that is the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you see, smash the buttons, like, subscribe, and go watch more videos.